thank you all for your practice. So, I went to dinner at my mom's house last night, and in order to do so, I normally keep all the cushions and blankets and stuff in a big bag. I'm sure most of you have seen this giant body bag that I have that I towed around in my back seat. Anyway, I forgot it at Laura's house last night, so I didn't have it today. And on the way to pick it up, I missed the exit that I was supposed to take. And if you're familiar with the interstate here, once you go past exit 5, there's no other exit. You have to basically go to Alabama and either take the back roads or turn around and go back the other way. And it's about a 15-minute detour each way. And I was already running late. And so it's oh, what a perfect opportunity to stress out about something I absolutely can't control at this point and create a lot of suffering for myself around something out of my control. But I didn't do that. I could have done that. I didn't do that. But you may notice that in this tradition, we talk, especially in the Theravada tradition, we talk a lot about suffering. Especially with even the Four Noble Truths. If you look at the Four Noble Truths, so first noble truth is that in life there is suffering. The second truth is that suffering is caused by craving. The third noble truth is that there is an end to suffering. So there is good news, there is an end to suffering. And the fourth noble truth is that there is a path that leads to the end of suffering. It's a lot of suffering, right? Suffering. It's when are we going to get to the happy shit, right? But I feel like there's a lot of confusion around pain and suffering. And I think there's a distinct difference between the two. And I think there's even more confusion added when we're talking about the word dukkha. Dukkha is this kind of catch-all term that we use to describe pain or suffering in this tradition. And it's translated in a few different ways. It's the most common translation is suffering. We hear dukkha, then we automatically think suffering. But I think some better translations are stress, unsatisfactoriness, even pain is a good translation for dukkha. And that's, like I said, I think there is a difference between pain and suffering. So if we're talking about pain, like the hard tax of life, pain, as the Buddha described in his first discourse about the Four Noble Truths, the setting of the wheel of Dharma into motion, we're talking about dukkha. And dukkha is basically what the Buddha laid out as birth is dukkha, sickness is dukkha, aging is dukkha, not getting what we want is dukkha, getting what we don't want is dukkha, losing people that we hold dear to us is dukkha, and being around people we don't necessarily care for, also dukkha, right? It's just unescapable pain. And there's a couple other different types of dukkha as well. There's what's known as viparinama dukkha, and this is the suffering that we experience when we're resistant to the fact that everything changes. There's nothing static in the world. Everything is conditioned and therefore impermanent. And when we push against that, we're going to suffer. And then there's Sankhara dukkha. And so this is where we really get into the suffering portion of the dukkha. This is the mental suffering, right? This is the suffering of our own minds. So pain is the initial jolt of the experience. The hard thing happens and it sucks. My dad died. That sucked. The stories that I created around it and all the added suffering, that's Sankhara dukkha. And so in this practice, we're working to train the mind in order to not create that added layer of suffering. And by being able to be with the pain rather than trying to avoid, change, fix, or control it. And that's not the easiest thing to do, is it, right? I don't know if you've noticed, but we don't exactly have as much control over the mind as we would like to have. We don't really have a lot of agency over the mind. I'm sure even you noticed in the breath, it's just pay attention to the breath. It's not always the easiest thing to do. It's the mind just wants to go in every other direction. It doesn't actually want to pay attention to the breath. So we don't have much control. We don't really have a lot of agency. And so while this practice is a training of the mind, it's also a study of the processes of the mind. And we're looking at the processes of the mind that actually lead to suffering And we're also looking at the processes of the mind that lead to the liberation of suffering, or nibbana. And even saying the mind is kind of almost giving misinformation, because I don't feel like there is no the mind, right? There is mind, because the mind itself is ever changing. In the Abhidharma, which is like the Buddhist book on it's like Buddhist psychology, basically. It's written in I think the 3rd century. There's actually 89 different types of chitta that are described in that. And chitta is translated generally as mind. So there's 89 different mental states that we can have. So if there's 89 mental states, how can we say the mind? The mind is a constantly evolving process of functions. And it's constantly changing. Anybody here familiar with the concept of anatta, or non-self? So, non-self is just this idea that there is no static, stable self, because we are a constantly set of changing and evolving processes. And this works in a funny way. So it generally, when we're talking about the processes of the mind and the way that the mind works, we're really talking about the 5 aggregates, or the 5 skandhas. And the 5 aggregates are form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. But the way they work is in that order. So I don't know why they listed them that way, because that's kind of fucked up, and I think they really threw everybody off with that. The way this works, if we're talking about how consciousness is created, and we're talking about how the mind and the processes of the mind are actually created, we have form, which is the basic object form, like body and anything external of the body, physical formations. Body makes contact with an object. So we have sense doors, and in Buddhism we have 6 sense doors. We have sight, smell, taste, touch, hearing, as well as the faculty of mind. So we have all the 5 normal senses plus the mind. The mind is also included as a sense. So form makes contact with object, and this creates consciousness. We have eye consciousness, nose consciousness, ear consciousness. Basically, whenever we come into contact, or whatever our attention makes contact, it creates consciousness. Consciousness leads to perception, so we're able to perceive things. And then how we perceive them is either going to be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Everybody following here? Or form leads to contact, which leads to consciousness, which leads to perception, which leads to feeling tone, Vedana. And then from the feeling tone, that's when we start to generate mental formations. This is when we really start building what are known as Sankhara. And Sankhara are the habituated patterns and processes of the mind. Now, when we examine the aggregates closely, we find that none of these are stable. These are also always changing. So there can be no permanent essence that we define as a self. So let's take form, for example. As I said, this aggregate includes all physical objects, including our bodies. But because our bodies are always changing, our cells are constantly regenerating, our hair grows, we age, not stable. And this is the same thing that we get with sensations, whether they're pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That is always changing. What can be pleasant in one moment can be unpleasant in the next. What's neutral in one moment can be unpleasant in the next. So this too is always changing. And this also leads to perception, mental formations, and consciousness also always changing. So there really is no stable, permanent sense of self. So when we cling to the idea of a stable self, of this solidified I, me, mine, this is what creates all of our suffering, for the most part. This is what creates all of this dukkha sankhara and this added layer of suffering that we have. When we get the ego involved, right? We feel like something has been done to me. That's when we start to suffer. But once we drop the ego and the static sense of self that we imagine exists, we can also stop building stories around our pain, and we stop generating these new sankhara. We stop taking things quite so personally, and we stop taking what is known as the second arrow. So imagine that you're walking through the woods And I don't know why you would be walking through the woods. Maybe you're at Juniper Creek and you're hiking and you get shot with an arrow. And you're like, that sucks. I got shot with an arrow. And then it's like, you go into the stories of, why is there someone out here shooting arrows? Why am I always getting arrows shot at me? Who the fuck would shoot me with an arrow? It's not fair, and this shouldn't be happening right now. Right. That is Dukkha Sankhara in a nutshell. Is we're taking a second arrow by just suffering over the first arrow. Like, the first arrow already sucks. You got shot with an arrow. Like, why would we make our pain any worse than it already is by adding layers of suffering? And so with Sankhara Dukkha, we really get caught up in the shoulds and the shouldn'ts and the not fair. It's not fair that happened. But life's not personal. Pain is inevitable, but the suffering layer is pretty optional, honestly. My friend Kevin Turner has this saying. He's like, it's just your turn. Like, this is the shit that happens to everybody. Sometimes it's just our turn. Like I said, we take things so personally. Has anybody ever felt like the universe was like out to get you? Like you and only you and nobody else but you? Like, why does this always happen to me? Man, that's me for sure. I used to do that so much. I got caught up in that shit real hard for a long time. It was pretty bad. But I've experienced a lot of trauma throughout my life, and my mind created these narratives around my trauma. And eventually, I was just living the narrative, as opposed to having any sense of actual freedom. I was bound by the limitations of the narrative that the pain in my life and the suffering I created around it gave me, in a sense. We make all these stories and these observations about the world based on information that we had at the time and our perception based on that information. And a lot of times we don't take into account that we're getting faulty information. So our sankhara, or our habituated patterns of mind, are just a reaction to our perception and the feeling tone that comes from that perception. But if you begin actually investigating these experiences, often you'll find that these stories aren't really rooted in anything. They're just fabrications. They're just sankhara. Just mental fabrications. The problem is we actually believe what the mind tells us to be true. I don't know about any of you guys, but my mind is full of shit. And then we act in the world based on this information that we've just really just bad information. And this is the second error. Like I said, this is everything that surrounds the stories and the shoulds or the shouldn'ts and the to-dos. That's a big thing. What should I do? What can I do? What did I do? All the doo-doo. We have a drastically imperfect perception of self and perception of other and perception of reality in general. And this can lead us to having what are called fixed views. Things are this way. They're only this way. Or this black and white thinking. Have any of you ever had black and white thinking? Yeah, me. For sure, me. But most things aren't black and white. There are many shades of gray, and rather than being this or that, they're often both and. They're generally both and. I know I've got some anarchist friends in the room, and we're particularly, and I too fall into that category a lot of the time, and most cops suck, but not all cops. I have met some decent cops, So it's this both and thing, right? But it's just, this process of the mind, these generating these negative sankharas that keep us in these habituated patterns, that keep us on this wheel of suffering. So if sankhara is the gas that keeps our suffering burning, then nibbana is the cessation of sankhara. It's the stilling of sankhara. It's the end of our reactivity. Stephen Batchelor actually translates Nibbana as a place of lessened reactivity. I also have some friends who actually think it's like a physiological shift in the brain, which I kind of lean towards as well. But for all intents and purposes, we'll just go with a lessening of reactivity. And I think if we could get to a place of lessened reactivity, that's a pretty good place to be in general. We don't have to have some sort of great physiological shift and gain weird super powers, like levitation and shit, which would be cool, right? I can't say that wouldn't be awesome, but I'd be okay with just not suffering as much and having a little bit lessened reactivity. I'd be okay with that. And this is all Third Noble Truth stuff. This is the end of suffering. Is this lessening of reactivity. And traditions like S.N. Goenka, as we were talking about, his teacher was Sayagi Ubakin. They will tell you that all of your suffering is purely Sankhara. Even manifestations of pain in the body are Sankhara, which I can't really discount because, trauma is stored in the body. But don't try asking one of their assistant teachers about that because it will not be very helpful for you, like whatsoever. But, suffering starts with the mind. Like I said, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. So how do we work with this process of the mind? What do we do? One of Joseph Goldstein's first teachers, Munindraji, said, well, if you want to know the mind, sit down and take a look at it. So we meditate. And we use this practice of vipassana and the practice of mindfulness. We become acquainted with the mind and we start observing the patterns of the mind. We start observing what happens when we get the pain in the leg. Do we immediately push away from it? Do we try to readjust, or can we be with that pain? What do we do when we get the discursive thoughts? Do we immediately look for something to distract us? Do we grab our phone? Do we turn on the TV? What do we do? Can we be with the discursive thoughts? Can we be with the painful emotions? Can we be with the pain? Because that's the only way out, is straight through. You can't get around pain. You have to go through it. It's the only way to stop your suffering. It's to go through it. And so, like I said, we could also live by the Eightfold Path. That's a good place to start. When we get our ethics in line, when we get our sila in line, when our actions and our speech and our livelihood aren't harming ourselves or harming anyone else, we stop generating a lot of the things that create our suffering. We get our concentration practice in line, when we put forth the effort towards the mindfulness and towards the concentration and towards investigation. I think that's a thing that gets left out a lot, and because it's not part of the Eightfold Path, but I think it's really, really important, is curiosity. Just observing the mind, watching the mind, seeing the habituated patterns of your own mind. If you want to get to know the mind, sit down and take a look at it. Just watch what it does. Over and over. I guarantee you'll see a lot of patterns if you just start sitting down and just paying attention to your mind. You start seeing that we do a lot of the same things over and over again. And a lot of these things cause us a lot of suffering. And nobody said life's going to be easy. Kind of sucks sometimes. I joke that could be the first noble truth. Have you noticed sometimes life sucks? That's pretty much it, right? But by turning inward, we can begin investigating the mind and the processes of the mind and see the nature of the mind. We start seeing our habituations and our biases and the stories that we create around pretty much every experience. We don't really have to do anything other than be curious. Other than just sit and be curious. Let's sit and be curious.